As we all know, the electric car market is accelerating at a fearsome pace, with new models being added seemingly every month. Now, Skoda is a company not wanting to miss out, and that's why it's introduced this, the Enyaq iV. It's its latest and arguably one of its greatest electric cars, but because this market is becoming so well populated with rivals, it really does have its job cut out. With a large battery and a spacious interior, it's designed to slot in easily in the space left over by a conventional petrol or diesel car. But can it succeed in other areas? Well, that's what we're here today to find out. The Enyaq iV incorporates many of the features that we've become accustomed to on the latest generation of Skoda vehicles. There's the large grille, which in this case is blanked off for better aerodynamic efficiency, and the sleek headlights, which are similar to those that you might see on the new Octavia. We've also got some neat other touches, including the gills at the side and the large alloy wheels. The Enyaq shares its platform with cars like the Volkswagen ID4 and the Audi Q4 e-tron. And so inside, the architecture is somewhat similar to those cars, but Skoda has made some neat touches to make this slightly more usable than those two other vehicles. For instance, these steering wheel buttons in this car are conventional buttons, so they're nice and easy to use. Switch to the Volkswagen and they're haptic style feedback ones, which really aren't that simple to operate. However, the areas that are shared are easy to use elsewhere. The large screen is really clear and it's nice and responsive too. Plus, there's plenty of storage here, so we've got some deep cubbies here, and then because of the lack of transmission connections, there's an extra section down here which is really useful for larger items. The level of fit and finish is also excellent, with a nice leather trimmed style dashboard here and this recessed secondary screen which looks really neat too. Overall, it's a great finish and it's a really comfortable place to be too. Because the Enyaq sits on a platform which has been designed specifically for EVs, the interior is far more spacious than a conventional petrol or diesel car. Take this for instance, there's no transmission hump in the middle. So the person sitting in the middle isn't going to get their feet squashed, and they're not going to be fighting it out with the other two people for the most spacious seats in the house. When you are sat either side though, you've got plenty of legroom and loads of headroom too, while there are some nifty storage solutions like the seat back pockets here and the smaller ones for devices. You've also got your own controls for the heating and ventilation. When it comes to boot space, the Enyaq does really well. In fact, there's 585 litres there with a large square access area, and you can fold down the rear seats too, and this increases it to 1,710 litres. Unfortunately, despite the lack of an engine, there isn't a frunk available in the Enyaq, but the cables can be stored underneath the boot floor. What have we got to work with in the Skoda Enyaq then? Well, we've got a 150 kilowatt electric motor, and that powers the rear wheels, which is a bit of a break from the norm in terms of electric cars. But all cars on the MEB platform, that's Skoda Enyaq, the Volkswagen ID4 and ID3, Audi's Q4 e-tron, they're all based on the same platform and they're all rear wheel drive. So that means we've got 150 kilowatts and 310 newton meters of torque sent to the rear wheels, and that means a 0 to 60 time of around about 8 seconds. So slightly slower than you might find in a comparable diesel or petrol car of the same size, but certainly more than quick enough for most situations. And because it is an electric car and you've got that electric motor, you've got instant response when you hit the throttle. So in fact it feels a little bit quicker and a little bit sharper than those initial figures might suggest. The driving experience overall is geared towards comfort, and that's really refreshing because this is a car which feels like it wants to integrate where your petrol or diesel car left off. It's not difficult to drive, it's not difficult to get up to speed with, and Skoda has been really careful to make sure that all of the controls are particularly user-friendly. Okay, we've got this large screen which can make adjusting certain aspects on the move a little bit tricky, but there are certain things where you can see that Skoda has thought things through. In cars like the ID3, these steering wheel buttons are haptic feedback ones, and they're really tricky to use. Skoda, what have they done? They just put proper buttons. So when you are traveling along, you can set the cruise control and it's not an issue. The steering itself is quite relaxed and not particularly energetic. It's easy to drive. It's a very, very simple car, and that's really nice. You can put the car in B mode, and that gives you the most amount of regenerative braking you can get. And actually that's quite helpful when you are around town, because you can let the throttle off and it'll bring it to a stop. And you don't have to be on and off the brake, you just let the throttle off. It's quite relaxing actually. This car is fitted with the largest battery you can get on the Enyaq, and that's a 77 kilowatt hour battery. Now Skoda claims that you should get around 331 miles from a single charge, and realistically you're probably not going to get quite near that figure. On a warm day we're talking around 300, on a cold day probably more in the 280 to 70 region. That said, that's still a decent range, but it just shows this slight difference between what manufacturers are claiming you're getting from a battery and what the conditions will allow you to get. So take it for instance, if you're traveling around town, if you're doing shorter journeys at lower speeds, you'll find that energy lasting an awful lot longer than if you're planning on using the Enyaq to travel up and down the motorway, where the motor has to work much harder to keep you up to speed, keep you at a constant high speed too. But even though this is quite a big car, it doesn't feel it on the road too much. And there's plenty of light in here. Skoda has ensured that there's lots of glass all the way through the car. And though that's more of a design touch, it does help you feel somewhat brighter behind the wheel. It means you don't feel hunkered in and you're not cocooned in, actually. The visibility in this car is good. The pillars are quite slim, the mirrors are large, and over the shoulder, Skoda, like I mentioned, has worked to put extra glass in, so actually there's not too bad over the shoulder visibility too. I would say that the rear screen is quite small, however, and this is a relatively long car, so you feel like you've got a long way to look before you get through that small rear window. In this car is also surprisingly good. This one sits on adjustable dampers, and that is an optional extra. I'd say it's one well worth ticking, because the Enyaq, regardless of which model you go for, sits on quite large alloy wheels. So if you're on standard springs, the car does ride a little bit more firmly than you'd like. That's exacerbated, of course, because you've got additional weight from those batteries compared to a normal car. These dampers you can soften right off, and even on broken roads, as we're all quite used to driving over in the UK, it's nice and pliable. And on the motorway, it's really comfortable. It's a really good job. Of course, like I mentioned, if you are going to be on the travelling on the motorway, you're going to be using that range up quicker. But when you are there, this car feels super refined and really nice and cosy. There's not too much road noise either. These large tyres are generating a little bit of sound which impedes onto the cabin. But by and large, it's not too bad. The best thing about the Enyaq for me is that it feels largely like a normal Skoda. And that's easier to live with for someone who might be approaching an EV for the first time, because initially at least, this doesn't feel any different to, say, a Kodiaq. Of course, the powertrain is different, and the way that it responds to your input is different to a normal petrol or diesel car. But in terms of control weights, in terms of the way the car moves down the road, and in terms of the way it rides, this car feels brilliantly ordinary, and that's the best thing about it for me. Given the sheer number of electric vehicles on sale today, it could have been quite easy for the Enyaq to get, well, a little bit lost, but that simply isn't the case. In fact, we'd go as far as to say that this is one of the very best electric cars on sale today. It's practical, it's quite good looking, it's got a good range, and because it's a Skoda, it's well priced too. In fact, if you are thinking of making the switch to an electric car, this is one car that should be really high up your list. Thank you for watching this new car review on the Skoda Enyaq iV. Now, what do you think of this car? Do you think you could be tempted into this out of a petrol or a diesel? Leave us a comment in the section below. Don't forget to leave us a like as well if you have enjoyed this video, and subscribe to the Motors.co.uk YouTube channel, hitting that bell icon so you're notified every time we upload a new video.